The exhaustion from my day lingered as I stepped through the door of our modest home in Seattle, Washington. Still dressed in my office attire, my tie hung loose around my neck, and my shoulders slumped under the weight of yet another cycle of back-to-back meetings and never-ending deadlines. I was 36 years old, and days like these made me feel twice that. All I wanted was to collapse on the couch and let the tension of the day melt away. But instead, I walked straight into a storm. Lauren, my wife of 7 years and now 34, stood in the living room, her arms tightly crossed over her chest. Her face was unreadable, but the intensity in her eyes made my stomach tighten. Without waiting for me to say anything, she spoke, her voice clipped. "Ethan, I'm not your maid." I froze, startled by her bluntness. "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying to keep my tone even, though my heart had started to race. Her words were like a bucket of cold water to the face, and the tired fog in my mind began to lift. "You come home, drop your bag, your coat, and your stress on me, and expect everything else to take care of itself." Her voice was steady, but there was something in it that felt different, a frustration that had been simmering for a long time. I glanced around the room. The coffee table was cluttered with unopened mail and a bowl from last night's late snack. The kitchen sink was home to a pile of dishes that hadn't been touched. It wasn't chaos, but it wasn't exactly welcoming either. Lauren didn't wait for me to respond. "Do you ever stop to think about how much I do, Ethan? The cooking, the cleaning, the endless mental checklist to make sure everything in this house runs smoothly. It's like none of it even registers with you." I opened my mouth to speak but hesitated, unsure of what to say. My instinct was to defend myself, to point out how hard I worked at the office every day. But something about the way Lauren looked at me, tired, drained, made me pause. She wasn't just venting. This was something deeper. "I'm working too, Lauren," I said finally, my voice low. "I'm the one making sure we're financially stable. Doesn't that count for something?" She laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that caught me off guard. "Do you think money solves everything? Do you think paying the bills makes up for the fact that I'm carrying everything else?" Her words stung, but what hurt more was the truth in them. I'd never considered how much Lauren did. She worked part-time as a graphic designer, which gave her more flexibility, but it also meant she picked up most of the slack at home. And I had gotten used to it. Too used to it. The argument replayed in my head long after Lauren stormed out of the room. I sank onto the couch, feeling the weight of her words settle over me. "I'm not your maid." The phrase echoed, making me feel ashamed and defensive at the same time. I stared at the cluttered room, suddenly noticing the things I'd ignored for weeks, the laundry basket in the corner, the faint smudges on the windows, the dust on the bookshelves. It wasn't just a reflection of the house, it was a reflection of us. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Lauren wasn't beside me. She had chosen to sleep in the guest room, and the cold, empty space beside me felt like a chasm I didn't know how to bridge. I thought about going to her, trying to talk, but I wasn't sure what I'd even say. Every word felt like an excuse, and I was too tired for another fight. The next morning, I woke up to an eerily silent house. Lauren had already left for her yoga class, a Saturday ritual she rarely skipped. Normally, she'd leave a note on the counter, something simple like, "Have a great day." But today there was nothing. It was a small detail, but it stung more than I wanted to admit. I walked into the kitchen, where the overflowing trash can caught my eye. Lauren had always been meticulous about taking it out before it got too full. Now it sat there, a silent reminder of her frustration. I poured myself a cup of coffee, deliberately ignoring the trash. If she wanted me to see her side of things, maybe it was time she saw mine. Over the next week, I decided to stop doing the little things I usually took care of, paying the electric bill, calling the plumber about the leaky faucet, organizing the garage. It wasn't revenge, at least that's what I told myself. It was about balance. If she felt like she was doing everything, then maybe she needed to understand what it felt like to shoulder the financial burden alone. Lauren noticed almost immediately. The trash stayed where it was, the laundry pile grew, and the faucet kept dripping. The tension in the house grew with each passing day. One evening, she came home to find the dishes from the night before still in the sink. She didn't say anything, but I saw the way her lips tightened and her eyes darted around the room, taking in the mess. Instead of commenting, she rolled up her sleeves and started washing the dishes with more force than necessary. Her silence was deafening. "Need help with that?" I asked cautiously, unsure if I really wanted to offer. She didn't even look at me. "No, thanks," she said curtly. "I wouldn't want to interrupt your busy schedule." I flinched at her tone but said nothing. I told myself it was progress, she was finally seeing how much work it took to keep everything running. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. This wasn't progress. It was a stalemate. One rainy Wednesday evening, Lauren came home from work later than usual. She was soaked from head to toe, her umbrella useless against the heavy Seattle downpour. She walked past me without a word, leaving a trail of water across the hardwood floor. "Rough day?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She dropped her bag on the counter with a thud and turned to face me, her expression unreadable. "You didn't take out the trash," she said flatly. I glanced at the overflowing bin. "I've been busy," I replied, keeping my voice calm. "I'll get to it." Her jaw tightened. "Busy with what, Ethan? Ignoring everything around you?" I exhaled, my patience wearing thin. "I don't see why it's such a big deal. It's just trash." Lauren's face flushed with anger, and before I could say another word, she grabbed the trash bag, tied it with a sharp tug, and stormed out the front door. A loud crash followed moments later, and I rushed outside to see the trash bag torn open on the driveway, its contents scattered by the wind and rain. Lauren was standing in the middle of the chaos, tears streaming down her face. "This is exactly how I feel," she yelled, her voice breaking. "Like I'm trying to hold everything together, and it just keeps falling apart." For a moment, I was too stunned to respond. The sight of her standing there, soaked and trembling, hit me harder than any of her words had. "Lauren," I said softly, stepping closer. "Come inside. Let's talk." But she shook her head, backing away. "You don't get it, Ethan. You still don't get it." That night, Lauren slept in the guest room again, and I was left alone with my thoughts. Her words replayed in my mind, "You don't get it." She was right. I didn't get it, not fully. I'd been so focused on my own frustrations that I hadn't stopped to consider hers. The house was silent, except for the faint sound of the rain against the windows. I sat on the couch, staring at the mess we'd both allowed to pile up. The unopened mail, the dirty dishes, the forgotten tasks, they were all symbols of something deeper. Our relationship wasn't just messy, it was neglected. The next morning, I woke up early and started cleaning. It wasn't much, just the kitchen and the trash, but it felt like a start. By the time Lauren came downstairs, I was wiping down the counters. She stopped in her tracks, her eyes scanning the room. "You cleaned," she said, her tone cautious. I nodded, avoiding her gaze. I figured it was time I started pulling my weight. She didn't respond immediately, and I braced myself for a sarcastic remark. But instead, she poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table. The silence between us was no longer hostile, but tentative, like we were both waiting to see what would happen next. Over the next few days, I made an effort to help around the house, not out of obligation, but because I realized how much it mattered. I started small, folding laundry, taking out the trash, loading the dishwasher. Lauren watched me with a mix of skepticism and curiosity, as though she wasn't sure if my efforts were genuine or temporary. One evening, I decided to cook dinner. It was nothing fancy, just spaghetti and Jared marinara, but it felt significant. Lauren walked into the kitchen as I was stirring the sauce, her eyebrows raised in surprise. "You're cooking?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. I shrugged, trying to play it cool. "Figured we could both use a break from takeout." She lingered in the doorway, watching me. For the first time in weeks, she smiled, a small, hesitant smile, but a smile nonetheless. "Do you need help?" she offered. I shook my head. "I've got it. You can relax for once." We ate together that night, the clinking of utensils filling the silence. The dinner wasn't perfect, the pasta was slightly overcooked, and I'd forgotten to season the sauce, but Lauren didn't complain. Instead, she helped me wash the dishes afterward, and for the first time in what felt like forever, it felt like we were on the same team. The quiet effort to rebuild our partnership continued, but old habits didn't disappear overnight. There were moments when I slipped back into my routine of forgetting to help out, and Lauren noticed every time. One evening, after a long day at work, I left the trash overflowing again. When Lauren came home and saw it, she didn't lash out, but her disappointment was clear in the way she avoided eye contact. "I thought we were working on this, Ethan," she said, her voice calm but tinged with weariness. "I know," I admitted, rubbing the back of my neck. "I messed up. I'll take care of it now." She sighed, crossing her arms. "It's not just about the trash. It's about showing that you care. That you're trying." Her words stayed with me as I tied up the bag and took it outside. She wasn't wrong, and I couldn't brush it off anymore. It wasn't just about the chores, it was about what they represented. Every dish left in the sink, every task I ignored, felt to her like a reminder that she was alone in this. The next morning, I woke up early and tackled the laundry that had been piling up in the corner of our bedroom. Lauren walked in as I was folding the last of the towels, her eyes widening in surprise. "Laundry? Is this real life?" she teased, a playful smirk breaking through her usually guarded expression. I chuckled, handing her a neatly folded towel. "Just trying to keep my promises." She took it, her fingers brushing against mine for a brief moment. It wasn't much, but it felt like progress. That evening, Lauren and I sat down at the dining table with a piece of paper and a pen. "We need a system," she said. "Something that keeps us both accountable." We spent the next hour creating a chore chart. It wasn't the most romantic activity, but it felt productive. Lauren took charge, dividing the responsibilities evenly and suggesting we trade off tasks each week. "You handle the trash and the bathroom," she said, tapping the pen against her chin. "I'll take care of the dishes and vacuuming. We'll alternate laundry." I nodded, scribbling down notes. "Fair enough." When we finished, Lauren leaned back in her chair, looking at the chart with a mixture of hope and caution. "Do you think this will work?" "I think it's a start," I replied. Over the next week, the changes were small but noticeable. The house slowly returned to order, and the tension between us began to ease. We found ourselves talking more, not just about the house, but about everything. It felt like we were reconnecting, piece by piece. One Friday evening, just as we were settling into a quiet dinner, Lauren's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at it, her face instantly clouding over. "It's my mom," she said, standing up abruptly. "I have to take this." She disappeared into the other room, and I could hear her voice rising, though the words were muffled. After a few minutes, she came back, her face pale and her hands trembling. "What's wrong?" I asked, standing up. "It's my dad," she said, her voice breaking. "He's in the hospital. A heart attack." Without another word, we both sprang into action. Within minutes, we were in the car, heading to the hospital. The tension from the past few weeks faded into the background as we focused on the urgent situation. When we arrived, the sight of Lauren's father, normally a strong, stoic man, hooked up to monitors was sobering. Lauren stayed by his bedside, holding his hand, while I sat in the corner, giving her space but ready to support her however I could. It was a long night, filled with uncertainty and fear. But in those hours, something shifted between us. When Lauren finally sat down beside me, leaning her head on my shoulder, I didn't hesitate. I wrapped my arm around her, holding her tightly. Lauren's father recovered, but the scare had left its mark. Over the following weeks, we spent more time with her parents, helping out with errands and chores. It gave me a new perspective on Lauren, her strength, her loyalty, and her deep sense of responsibility. At the same time, it made me more determined to be a better partner. I started stepping up in ways I hadn't before, not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to. Lauren noticed the difference, and slowly, the walls between us began to crumble. One evening, as we sat on the couch together, she rested her hand on mine. "Thank you," she said softly. "For everything you've done lately." I squeezed her hand. "I just want to make things better, Lauren. For us." She smiled, a genuine, warm smile that I hadn't seen in months. "You are." The weeks following Lauren's father's recovery felt like a turning point in our marriage. We weren't just addressing the surface-level issues anymore, we were learning how to be partners again. The chore chart was still in place, but what made the difference wasn't the tasks, it was the intention behind them. One Friday evening, I surprised Lauren with dinner reservations at a cozy French bistro downtown. It was a place she'd mentioned months ago, a small detail I hadn't forgotten. When I told her, her eyes widened with surprise. "You remembered?" she asked, her voice soft with disbelief. "Of course," I said with a grin. "You've been doing so much for everyone else lately. I thought you deserved a night out." Her smile was radiant, and for the first time in what felt like forever, we laughed and talked like we used to. Over wine and crème brûlée, we reminisced about our early days together, the long walks, the late-night talks, and the dreams we'd shared before life got so complicated. "I missed this," she said as we walked back to the car under the glow of the city lights. She slipped her hand into mine, and I squeezed it gently. "Me too," I replied. One quiet Sunday morning, we sat on the back porch, sipping coffee as the sunlight filtered through the trees. The air was crisp, and for the first time in months, everything felt calm. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Lauren said, her voice thoughtful. I nodded. "Yeah, we have. But I don't want us to stop here. I want us to keep growing." She turned to look at me, her eyes soft but serious. "What does that look like for you, Ethan?" I thought for a moment before replying. "It looks like us making time for each other, even when life gets busy. It looks like communicating better, so things don't build up like they did before. And it looks like remembering that we're in this together." Lauren smiled, leaning her head on my shoulder. "I like the sound of that." As the days turned into weeks, we continued to build on that foundation. We made time for date nights, tackled household projects together, and set aside a weekly check-in where we could openly talk about anything on our minds. It wasn't always perfect, there were still occasional arguments and moments of frustration, but the difference was that we were committed to working through them. One evening, as we sat together on the couch, Lauren rested her head on my chest. The TV played softly in the background, but neither of us was really watching it. "Ethan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah?" "I'm proud of us," she said, her words simple but heartfelt. "I wasn't sure we'd get here, but we did." I kissed the top of her head, feeling a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. "Me too." Our journey hadn't been easy. It had been messy, painful, and filled with moments of doubt. But through it all, we had chosen each other. We had chosen to fight for our marriage, to see the best in each other even when it wasn't easy, and to rebuild what we'd almost lost. As I held Lauren in my arms, I realized that we weren't just repairing the cracks in our relationship, we were creating something stronger. And for the first time in years, I felt hopeful about the future. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew one thing for certain: we would face them together.